The man standing at my front door wasn't supposed to exist. 3 years earlier, I'd stood beside my wife as she buried him. I watched the coffin lowered into the ground. I saw her cry until she collapsed. I remember the cold wind that afternoon, the folded American flag handed to her, because everyone believed he had been a respected businessman who had lived an extraordinary life. I remember the long line of mourners offering quiet condolences, the minister speaking about legacy, and the silence that settled over the cemetery after everyone had gone home. I remember every detail because, at the time, I was only a stranger standing in the crowd, someone who had no idea that fate would eventually place me in that man's home, wearing his wedding ring's replacement on the hand of the woman he had once called his wife. Yet there he was, smiling, looking healthier than any dead man had the right to look, asking me, politely, if he could come inside his own house. My name is Daniel Carter, and what happened over the next 7 days destroyed everything I believed about love, grief, loyalty, money, and the woman I married. Before I tell you how my life unraveled, before you decide who was lying and who was telling the truth, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I wish I could tell you this story has a simple explanation. It doesn't. Every answer only created another question, and by the time it was over, I realized the greatest mysteries are rarely hidden underground. They're hidden inside the people we trust the most. When people hear a story like mine, they immediately assume they know how it ends. They picture an elaborate scam, a woman chasing money, or a husband slowly losing his grip on reality. I probably would have thought exactly the same thing if someone else had been telling this story instead of living it. But life has a way of ignoring the endings we expect. The truth is that I wasn't always the husband of a wealthy widow. I wasn't looking for a fortune, a mansion, or a second chance at luxury. At 58 years old, I believed the biggest chapters of my life were already behind me. After a marriage that ended quietly rather than dramatically, I had accepted that my future would probably consist of ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and learning how to enjoy my own company. I had spent nearly 3 decades building a respectable career in commercial construction across the Midwest, saved carefully, invested wisely, and planned for retirement the same way millions of Americans do. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't struggling either. What I wanted wasn't another paycheck. It was someone to share breakfast with, someone who would ask how my day had gone and actually wait for the answer. Loneliness doesn't always arrive with dramatic heartbreak. Sometimes it simply settles into the empty chair across the dinner table until one day you realize you've stopped setting out 2 plates. I met Evelyn Harper completely by accident during a charity fundraiser held at a historic museum outside Columbus, Ohio. She wasn't trying to attract attention, even though everyone in the room seemed to know exactly who she was. Conversations paused when she walked past. People greeted her with genuine respect rather than forced admiration. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that money alone could never buy. She was 56 years old, elegant without appearing distant, thoughtful without trying to impress anyone. I later learned she owned several successful logistics companies that she and her late husband had built over decades, making her one of the wealthiest women in the county. Yet during our first conversation, she spoke less about business than she did about old books, national parks, and how sunsets look different depending on which state you happen to be driving through. There was sadness in her eyes that never completely disappeared, even when she smiled. And although I couldn't explain why, I found myself wanting to know the story behind it. At the time, I had no idea that her past wasn't finished with either of us. I believed I was meeting a woman who had survived unimaginable loss and somehow found the strength to keep moving forward. I never imagined that the man everyone believed was gone forever would one day stand on our front porch, look directly into my eyes, and politely introduce himself as the husband whose funeral the entire town had witnessed. That was the moment my search for happiness became the beginning of a mystery that would challenge every memory, every promise, and every certainty I had ever held. If someone had asked me 5 years earlier whether I believed in second chances, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject. By then, I had learned that life doesn't always end with dramatic betrayals or spectacular victories. More often, it simply wears people down one ordinary day at a time. My divorce after 31 years of marriage hadn't happened because of infidelity or constant fighting. My former wife and I had simply become strangers sharing the same address. Two people moving through familiar routines without truly seeing one another anymore. When the papers were finally signed, there were no shouting matches, no broken furniture, and no desperate attempts to change each other's minds. There was only silence. Friends told me I would eventually meet someone else, but I had stopped believing those kind of promises. At 58 years old, I had accepted that my future would probably be peaceful, predictable, and mostly lived alone. I spent my weekdays consulting for commercial construction firms throughout Central Ohio and my weekends restoring an old fishing boat that rarely touched the water. My children had families of their own, and while we spoke often, they had their own lives to build. I wasn't unhappy. I simply believed that the chapter called romance had quietly reached its final page. Everything changed because of an invitation I almost declined. A longtime business associate convinced me to attend a fundraising gala benefiting military veterans and first responders at a restored 19th century estate outside Columbus. Formal events had never been my favorite, but he insisted the organizers needed additional sponsors from the local business community. I agreed more out of obligation than excitement, expecting an evening filled with polite conversations, expensive dinners, and speeches I would probably forget before reaching home. Instead, I found myself standing beside a display of historical photographs when a woman stopped to study the same exhibit. She wore a dark blue evening dress that reflected quiet elegance rather than wealth. And although people greeted her constantly as they passed, she never behaved as though she expected their attention. She smiled warmly, thanked each person by name, and returned her focus to the photographs with remarkable sincerity. When she noticed me studying an old black-and-white image of returning World War II soldiers, she quietly remarked that every photograph captured two stories at once, the one everyone could see and the one nobody would ever know. It was such an unusual observation that I laughed softly before introducing myself. "Daniel Carter," I said. She extended her hand and answered with a gentle smile. "Evelyn Harper." At that moment, the name meant nothing to me. Within 24 hours, I would discover that nearly everyone else in the county knew exactly who she was. During dinner, I learned that Evelyn owned Harper Logistics, a transportation company that had expanded into warehousing, commercial real estate, and regional distribution centers across several Midwestern states. Business magazines occasionally profiled her company, though she seemed almost embarrassed whenever someone praised its success. She redirected every compliment toward the employees who had helped build it and spoke about leadership as though it were a responsibility rather than a privilege. Only later did someone quietly explain that much of the company's growth had begun under her late husband, Richard Harper, whose sudden death 3 years earlier had stunned both the business community and the town where they lived. She almost disappeared after he died. One guest whispered to me while Evelyn was speaking with another donor. People weren't sure she'd ever recover. She stayed away from public events for nearly a year. I glanced across the ballroom and noticed that although Evelyn smiled often, there was something restrained about it, as though joy required more effort than it once had. Grief leaves marks that expensive clothing and beautiful homes cannot hide. I recognized that expression because I had seen a version of it in my own mirror after my marriage ended. Ours were different losses, but loneliness has a way of recognizing itself in another person. Over the following months, our paths crossed with surprising regularity. Sometimes it was at another charitable event. Sometimes it was a quiet coffee shop overlooking the Scioto River, where neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation. Other times we met for lunch after discovering we both happened to be nearby for separate business meetings. We talked about books, travel, family traditions, aging parents, and the strange realization that life after 50 often moved faster than life before 40. Curiously, there was one subject Evelyn almost never discussed unless someone else mentioned it first: her late husband. She never refused to answer questions, but her responses remained brief and carefully measured. Richard was a remarkable businessman, she would say before steering the conversation elsewhere. He believed in treating people fairly. Then she would ask about my latest construction project or whether I had taken my fishing boat out recently. At first, I assumed she simply wished to protect painful memories. After all, everyone grieves differently. I respected that boundary without realizing that it surrounded far more than old heartache. By the time winter arrived, our friendship had grown into something deeper than either of us expected. We found comfort in ordinary routines. Saturday breakfast became Sunday drives through small Ohio towns. Long conversations replaced awkward silences. Holidays that once felt empty slowly became occasions worth anticipating again. My children noticed the difference before I did. My daughter smiled one afternoon and told me I laughed more than I had in years. She was right. For the first time since my divorce, the future no longer looked like an endless series of identical days. It looked hopeful. When I eventually asked Evelyn whether she believed people could truly fall in love more than once in a lifetime, she looked out the restaurant window for several seconds before quietly answering, "I think the heart is capable of carrying yesterday without refusing tomorrow." At the time, I thought it was one of the most beautiful things anyone had ever said to me. Looking back now, I realize those words carried a meaning I completely misunderstood. They weren't just about healing after loss. They were about living with a past that refused to stay buried. And before either of us could fully understand what that meant, the first small crack appeared in the perfect life we believed we were building together. It arrived in the form of a locked room inside a mansion where one man had supposedly died, and by the spring of the following year, Evelyn Harper had become the most important person in my life. Looking back, I can still remember how effortless everything seemed during those months. There were no games, no uncertainty, and none of the emotional exhaustion that often follows people into relationships later in life. We understood each other's scars without needing lengthy explanations. We had both experienced loss in different forms, and perhaps that was why being together felt so natural. When I proposed during a quiet weekend trip along Lake Erie, Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out across the water for nearly a minute while the evening sun reflected across the waves. For a moment, I worried she was going to refuse. Then I noticed tears gathering in her eyes. She smiled, squeezed my hand, and whispered a single word: "Yes." It remains one of the happiest memories of my life. The wedding itself was modest despite her wealth. Close friends, family members, and a few business associates gathered for a ceremony that felt sincere rather than extravagant. As I watched Evelyn walk toward me that afternoon, I truly believed every difficult chapter in both our lives had finally led us to that moment. I believed we were beginning a future together. I had no idea we were walking directly toward a past neither of us could escape. 3 months after our wedding, I moved into the Harper estate, a sprawling property located on nearly 50 acres outside a small Ohio town. Calling it a house almost felt inaccurate. The residence looked more like a historic retreat than a family home. The property included rolling hills, private walking trails, guest cottages, and a small lake surrounded by old maple trees. It was beautiful without feeling ostentatious. Every room reflected decades of careful attention rather than impulsive spending. Yet for my first week there, I noticed something difficult to explain. Most houses eventually begin to feel familiar. This one never did. Certain rooms seemed frozen in time. Certain hallways felt untouched by the years. It wasn't frightening exactly. It was simply strange. The estate carried the unmistakable feeling that someone else's presence still lingered there, not physically, but emotionally. Richard Harper's photographs remained displayed throughout the home. His achievements filled shelves and office walls. Family portraits showed him standing beside Evelyn during happier years. I understood why she kept them. He had been a significant part of her life. Removing every reminder would have felt unnatural. Even so, there were moments when I felt less like the new husband and more like a temporary guest occupying another man's place. One evening, roughly 2 weeks after moving in, I noticed something unusual. As Evelyn and I prepared for bed, I heard footsteps somewhere on the second floor. The sound lasted only a few seconds before disappearing. At first, I assumed it was one of the household staff finishing late-night work. The estate employed a groundskeeper, a housekeeper, and a maintenance supervisor who occasionally remained on site after dark. I thought nothing of it until the following night when I heard the same sound again. Slow footsteps, deliberate, moving somewhere above us, despite the fact that no one else was supposed to be in that section of the house. When I mentioned it to Evelyn the next morning, she hesitated briefly before explaining that old homes often settled during temperature changes. It was a reasonable answer, and I accepted it. Yet the explanation became harder to believe when the sounds continued. Sometimes they occurred after midnight. Other times, just before dawn. Always faint, always brief, always impossible to trace to a specific room. Over the following weeks, additional oddities began accumulating. A light would occasionally appear in an upstairs room that nobody used. A study door that I distinctly remember closing would somehow be open the next morning. Once, I discovered a freshly brewed pot of coffee waiting in the kitchen before anyone else had arrived for work. The housekeeper insisted she had made it. The groundskeeper denied entering the residence that morning. Even Evelyn looked puzzled when I asked her about it. Individually, each event seemed insignificant. Together, they created a growing sense that something inside the estate wasn't quite right. What troubled me most wasn't the events themselves. It was the reactions they produced. Whenever I raised these questions, conversations became uncomfortable. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Answers grew vague. Subjects changed unexpectedly. It felt as though everyone knew something they weren't discussing openly. Then there was the room that existed at the end of the East Wing corridor. During my first tour of the house after moving in, I noticed the heavy wooden door immediately. Unlike every other room, it remained locked. A small brass keyhole sat beneath the handle, and the door appeared far newer than the surrounding architecture. Naturally, I asked about it. Evelyn's response arrived so quickly that it caught me off guard. "Please don't open that room," she said quietly. Not angrily, not defensively, simply firmly. When I asked why, she lowered her eyes and explained that it contained personal items she wasn't ready to sort through. I assumed she meant belongings connected to Richard. Grief affects people differently, and I respected her wishes. Yet what stayed with me wasn't her explanation. It was the expression on her face afterward. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely afraid. Not sad, not nostalgic, afraid. As summer approached, Evelyn herself began changing in subtle ways. She remained loving and attentive, but there were moments when she seemed distracted by thoughts she refused to share. Late-night phone calls became increasingly common. Sometimes she stepped outside to take them. Other times she locked herself inside her office for extended periods. I noticed new security cameras being installed around the property without any clear explanation. Additional exterior lights appeared near the driveway and guest cottages. When I asked whether there had been a security concern, she simply said she preferred being cautious. It sounded reasonable, yet her anxiety continued growing. Certain days, she seemed perfectly normal. On others, she looked as though she were waiting for something she couldn't prevent. The turning point arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I had woken early and decided to take a walk around the property before breakfast. The storm from the previous night had left the ground soaked and muddy. As I rounded the side of the house, I noticed a trail of footprints leading toward a side entrance near the east wing. At first, I assumed they belonged to one of the staff members. Then I looked closer. The footprints appeared fresh, very fresh, and they weren't leading away from the house. They were leading toward it. Following them carefully, I watched the muddy impressions continue through the entrance hallway and disappear directly in front of the locked room. I stood there for several seconds staring at the door. The footprints stopped abruptly. There were no tracks leading away. No explanation, just a locked room and a trail that ended at its threshold. For the first time since moving into the Harper estate, I felt a genuine sense of unease. Something wasn't adding up, and deep down, I had the growing feeling that whatever answers existed were hidden behind that door. The same door Evelyn had begged me never to open. The same door that seemed connected to a past everyone wanted to leave untouched. What I didn't know then was that the truth waiting behind it would eventually lead me to a man who was supposed to be dead. A man whose return would change all of our lives forever. The footprints stayed in my mind far longer than I wanted to admit. I wish I could tell you I simply ignored them, convinced myself there was a reasonable explanation, and moved on with my life. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But curiosity has a strange way of growing stronger when every answer raises another question. For the next several days, I found myself replaying that morning over and over. The muddy prints had been real. I hadn't imagined them. They had begun outside the house after a night of heavy rain, continued through the side entrance, and ended directly in front of the locked room. There had been no trail leading away. The maintenance supervisor insisted no one had entered that wing. The housekeeper claimed she hadn't gone near the room in months. Even the groundskeeper looked genuinely confused when I described what I had seen. Yet what unsettled me most wasn't that nobody could explain the footprints. It was that nobody seemed interested in trying. Every conversation ended the same way. An awkward silence, a polite smile. Then someone quickly changed the subject. It was almost as if the entire household had silently agreed that certain questions should never be asked. I began paying closer attention to the people around me. The longer I lived at the Harper estate, the more I realized that everyone carried themselves differently whenever Richard Harper's name entered a conversation. Friends who had known him for decades suddenly became cautious with their words. Employees who normally joked during lunch became noticeably reserved. Even longtime business associates seemed uncomfortable discussing the years surrounding his death. One afternoon, I joined Evelyn for a charity luncheon attended by several executives who had worked alongside Richard before his passing. During dessert, one gentleman casually mentioned a transportation contract Richard had negotiated years earlier. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before another executive interrupted with a completely unrelated story about market conditions. It happened so naturally that most people probably never noticed. I did. It wasn't the first time someone had redirected a conversation involving Richard, and by then it was becoming impossible to ignore. I couldn't explain why everyone behaved that way, but I knew enough about human nature to recognize when people were protecting something. Whether they were protecting a painful memory or an uncomfortable truth, I couldn't yet tell. Eventually, I decided that if nobody wanted to answer my questions, I would start looking for answers myself. My career in construction had taught me something valuable over the years. Every building leaves a paper trail. Permits, inspections, contracts, photographs, insurance documents. Every important event creates records somewhere. I assumed a man's death would be no different. Without mentioning my growing concerns to Evelyn, I spent several afternoons researching publicly available records at the county courthouse and local historical archives. Everything I found appeared perfectly ordinary. Richard Harper's death certificate had been properly filed. Newspaper articles described him as a respected entrepreneur and generous philanthropist whose sudden passing had shocked the community. Local television stations had covered the funeral because hundreds of residents attended, including elected officials, veterans organizations, and employees from every one of his companies. Reading those articles only increased my confusion. Every source confirmed the same conclusion. Richard Harper had died. His funeral had taken place. His body had been buried in a private cemetery outside town. There were photographs of mourners arriving at the church, photographs of the procession, even aerial images showing hundreds of vehicles filling nearby roads. Nothing suggested anything unusual had occurred. If there had been deception, it had been hidden remarkably well. Still, one detail refused to leave my thoughts. Every newspaper described the funeral service in almost identical language, yet none mentioned family members viewing the body beforehand. That struck me as unusual. In many American funerals, particularly in smaller communities, family and close friends often spend private moments with the deceased before the public ceremony begins. I wasn't suggesting that every family followed the same traditions, but considering Richard's prominence, I expected someone to have mentioned it. Instead, article after article referred only to a closed casket ceremony. Perhaps there had been severe injuries. Perhaps the family had simply preferred privacy. Either explanation made sense. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized nobody had ever actually told me how Richard died. They always used broad descriptions. Tragic, sudden, unexpected, never specific. It was remarkable how much information could be hidden inside ordinary words. A week later, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. While visiting a small hardware store to purchase supplies for repairing one of the estate's garden benches, I happened to meet Harold Benson, a retired county sheriff whose name I recognized from several old newspaper articles. After learning where I lived, he smiled politely and asked how I was adjusting to life at the Harper estate. We exchanged small talk for several minutes before I casually mentioned Richard Harper. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. Harold remained silent long enough that I wondered whether I had offended him. Finally, he leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. Richard was a good man, he said carefully. Far as anybody could tell, anyway. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. He glanced toward the front window of the store before speaking again. His death raised a few eyebrows back then. Nothing anyone could prove. Just questions. That single word captured my attention immediately. Questions. I asked him what he meant. Harold hesitated, clearly debating whether he should continue. Officially, everything checked out, he finally replied. The paperwork was clean. The investigation didn't uncover anything criminal. But every now and then you'd hear someone mention little things that didn't quite fit together. Nothing solid enough to reopen a case. Just enough to make an old sheriff wonder if he'd missed something. Before I could ask another question, he politely excused himself, climbed into his pickup truck, and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot with more uncertainty than ever. That conversation changed something inside me. Until then, I had been trying to convince myself I was simply overthinking harmless coincidences. Harold's words made that impossible. If a retired sheriff still remembered unanswered questions 3 years later, perhaps my instincts weren't completely unreasonable. That evening, after returning home, I wandered through the East Wing almost without thinking. The hallway remained quiet. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across polished hardwood floors. At the end of the corridor stood the locked door exactly where it had always been. I stared at it for several moments before gently placing my hand against the wood. It felt cool beneath my fingertips. I wasn't trying to invade Evelyn's privacy. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I simply wanted to understand why an entire section of the house seemed frozen in another lifetime. As I turned away, something caught my attention near the baseboard. Barely visible beneath a decorative cabinet sat a small brass object covered in dust. I bent down and picked it up. It was an old-fashioned key. For several minutes, I simply stood there holding it. Common sense told me to put it back exactly where I had found it. Respect told me the same thing. But another voice inside my head kept asking the question that had haunted me ever since discovering those footprints. What if every strange event somehow connected to this room? What if the answers Evelyn refused to discuss were hidden only a few feet away? My heart pounded harder than I cared to admit as I stepped toward the door. The hallway suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. Carefully, almost reluctantly, I inserted the key into the lock. It slid in effortlessly. For a moment, I considered stopping. Once a door is opened, it can never truly be closed again. Whatever waited on the other side had remained hidden for years. Taking one slow breath, I turned the key. A soft click echoed through the empty hallway. My hand settled on the doorknob as every instinct warned me that my life was about to change. I slowly pushed the door open, expecting little more than old furniture and forgotten memories. Instead, I found something that made every question far more difficult to answer. The room wasn't abandoned at all. It looked as though someone had walked out only moments earlier and fully intended to return. For several seconds, I couldn't move. My hand remained on the doorknob while my eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. I had expected dust-covered furniture, forgotten boxes, and a quiet decay that usually settles into rooms left untouched for years. Instead, the air inside felt remarkably fresh. Sunlight slipped through partially open curtains, illuminating polished hardwood floors that looked as though someone had cleaned them only days earlier. There wasn't a single sheet covering the furniture. Nothing had been packed away. Nothing suggested this room belonged to a man whose funeral had taken place 3 years before. It looked exactly like the private study and bedroom of someone who had simply stepped outside for an afternoon meeting. The king-size bed was perfectly made. A navy blue suit hung neatly on a valet stand beside the closet. Leather shoes sat beneath it, freshly polished. On the nightstand rested a wristwatch, a pair of reading glasses, and a leather wallet placed with careful precision. A fountain pen lay beside an open notebook, its last written sentence ending abruptly in the middle of a thought. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. Why would anyone preserve an entire room like this for so many years? Grief often leads people to hold on to photographs, clothing, or treasured possessions. But preserving an entire living space exactly as it had been left felt entirely different. It wasn't a memorial. It felt like preparation for someone's return. As I stepped farther inside, the room revealed more details that only deepened the mystery. Family photographs covered one wall, showing Richard Harper and Evelyn through different stages of their lives. There they were celebrating anniversaries, standing beside fishing boats, attending charity events, smiling in front of national parks during vacations across the American West. They looked genuinely happy together. There was no obvious sign of hidden conflict or unhappiness. Another shelf displayed awards recognizing Richard's contributions to local businesses and veterans organizations. His framed military service certificate rested beside several photographs of employees gathered at company celebrations. Every object inside the room reflected a man respected by his community and deeply loved by his wife. Yet one detail immediately caught my attention. The calendar hanging beside the desk remained open to the month of October, 3 years earlier. Several appointments had been circled in blue ink. One meeting with attorneys, another labeled board review. Then, 3 days later, a simple handwritten reminder that read, meet E6:30. After that date, every remaining page of the calendar was completely blank. It was as though time itself had stopped inside those four walls. Curiosity slowly overcame hesitation. I wasn't searching for money or secrets. At least that wasn't how I justified my actions to myself. I simply hoped to understand why Evelyn had guarded this room so carefully. I opened the top drawer of the desk and found neatly organized business files, handwritten notes, and several leather-bound journals arranged in chronological order. Most contained ordinary observations about company operations, employee performance, and travel schedules. Richard's handwriting reflected the personality people had described to me: disciplined, methodical, and remarkably organized. Then I noticed something unusual. The final journal ended nearly 6 weeks before his reported death. There were no entries covering the period immediately before the accident that supposedly claimed his life. I searched through every drawer, convinced another notebook must exist somewhere, but it never appeared. Either Richard had stopped writing for the first time in decades, or those final weeks had been removed intentionally. Neither explanation felt satisfying. Before I could continue searching, a faint sound echoed somewhere downstairs. My pulse quickened instantly. I quietly closed the drawer and listened. The house remained silent. Perhaps it had only been the old wooden floors settling. Even so, I suddenly became aware that I was standing inside a room my wife had specifically asked me never to enter. I was preparing to leave when another object drew my attention. Resting beneath the desk sat a small fireproof document safe. It wasn't hidden particularly well, and unlike the room itself, it stood unlocked. Inside were insurance policies, property deeds, stock certificates, and several sealed envelopes labeled with dates. One envelope, however, bore no date at all. Instead, written neatly across the front were 6 words that immediately sent a chill through me. Open only if I return. I stared at the envelope, convinced I had misunderstood what I was reading. Return? The choice of words made no sense. If Richard had expected to die, why write about returning? And if he hadn't expected to die, why would such an envelope exist in the first place? I reached toward it instinctively before stopping myself. Whatever explanation existed, opening a sealed personal letter crossed a line I wasn't prepared to cross. I carefully placed everything back exactly as I'd found it, closed the safe, and stepped away. Yet those 6 words remained fixed in my mind. They refused to fit into any ordinary explanation. That evening at dinner, I watched Evelyn more closely than ever before. She appeared calm, asking about my day and discussing plans for an upcoming charity auction as though nothing unusual had happened. More than once I nearly admitted that I had entered the locked room. Each time, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I decided to ask a simpler question. What was Richard like during his last few weeks? The fork in Evelyn's hand stopped moving. It was only for a second, but I noticed. She looked down at her plate before answering carefully. He was busy. The company was expanding. There were a lot of meetings. I nodded. Did anything seem different about him? This time she looked directly into my eyes. There was sadness there, but something else as well. It almost resembled caution. Why are you asking that? She replied quietly. I shrugged, pretending the question had simply crossed my mind. She forced a small smile and changed the subject to vacation plans. The conversation continued normally, yet I could feel an invisible wall rising between us. It wasn't anger. It was as though she feared where certain questions might lead. The following morning, I drove into town hoping fresh air would clear my thoughts. Instead, I encountered another piece of the puzzle. While having coffee at a small diner near the courthouse, an elderly waitress noticed the Harper estate address on a receipt I had signed. "You live up there now?" she asked kindly. When I nodded, she smiled with genuine warmth. Richard used to stop here every Thursday morning before work. Ordered the same breakfast every time. We spoke casually for several minutes before she mentioned something that caught my attention. Funny thing is, the Thursday before everybody said he died, he told me he'd probably be gone for a while. I looked at her carefully. Gone for business? I asked. She frowned slightly. I don't remember exactly. Just remember thinking it sounded like a long trip. Then a few days later, the whole town heard he was dead. She shrugged and walked away to serve another table, never realizing that her passing memory had completely altered the direction of my thoughts. By the time I returned home that afternoon, I could no longer convince myself these were isolated coincidences. A preserved room, missing journal entries, an envelope referencing a return. A waitress, remembering Richard saying he would be gone before news of his death reached the town. Individually, each detail could probably be explained away. Together, they painted a picture that made less and less sense. I decided that evening I would finally confront Evelyn with everything I had discovered. Secrets have a way of growing larger the longer they remain hidden, and our marriage deserved honesty. I rehearsed the conversation in my mind as I parked my truck in front of the house. But before I could reach the front steps, I noticed an unfamiliar black sedan already sitting in the driveway. The engine had just been switched off. A tall, gray-haired man stepped out slowly, straightened his jacket, and looked toward the front door with the calm confidence of someone arriving at a place he knew by heart. I had never seen him before. Yet something about the expression on his face made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't lost. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't asking for directions. He looked exactly like a man coming home. I stood frozen beside my truck as the gray-haired stranger slowly closed the driver's door behind him. There was nothing hurried or uncertain about the way he carried himself. He looked around the property with quiet familiarity, as though he had repeated this routine hundreds of times before. His eyes drifted across the lake, the oak trees lining the driveway, and finally settled on the front porch. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to impress or intimidate another person. It was the smile of a man recognizing home after a very long absence. Every instinct told me to ask who he was before he reached the front door, but my feet refused to move. Something deep inside me already knew the answer, even though my mind refused to accept it. The stranger climbed the porch steps, reached for the brass door knocker, and before he could touch it, I finally found my voice. "Can I help you?" He turned toward me with remarkable calm, studying my face for several seconds before extending his hand. "You must be Daniel," he said politely. "I've heard a great deal about you." My heartbeat seemed to stop. I had never seen this man before. I had certainly never introduced myself to him. Yet somehow he knew exactly who I was. Then came the sentence that shattered every certainty I had left. "My name is Richard Harper," he said. "I believe you're living in my house." For a few seconds, the world around me seemed to disappear. The breeze through the trees, the distant sound of birds, even the traffic from the highway beyond the property faded into complete silence. I simply stared at the man standing in front of me. He looked to be in his early 60s. His hair had turned more silver than the photographs inside the locked room, but there was no mistaking his face. I had seen those photographs dozens of times over the past several months. The framed portraits in the hallway, the family albums, the pictures inside his preserved bedroom. Every feature matched. The same eyes, the same smile, the same unmistakable resemblance. My rational mind immediately searched for another explanation. A brother I had never heard about, a cousin, a talented impersonator. But none of those possibilities survived longer than a few seconds. He wasn't pretending to know this place. He genuinely knew it. His eyes drifted toward the guest cottage before casually remarking, "Looks like they finally repaired the roof. It had been leaking over the north corner for years." I hadn't told anyone about that repair. It had only been completed 3 months earlier after extensive work. Before I could respond, he looked toward the detached garage and quietly laughed. "I always told Evelyn she should have planted maple trees instead of pine over there. The pine needles clogged every drain we had." Again, he was right. Every word matched conversations Evelyn herself had mentioned during landscaping projects. Whoever this man was, he possessed knowledge that no stranger should have had. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and stepped back several feet. "Don't come any closer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm calling the sheriff." Richard slowly nodded. "That's probably what I'd do if our positions were reversed." There wasn't the slightest hint of panic in his voice. He simply stood where he was with his hands visible, making no attempt to approach the house. Within 20 minutes, 2 deputies arrived at the estate. I explained everything as clearly as I could, expecting them to remove the stranger immediately. Instead, something unexpected happened. Richard calmly produced a driver's license issued under his own name. Then came an expired passport, military identification, corporate records, old tax documents, and family photographs that had clearly never been released publicly. One deputy quietly walked to his patrol car and began making phone calls while the other compared the documents with county records. The expressions on both officers slowly shifted from skepticism to complete confusion. Neither officer accused Richard of fraud. Neither officer placed him under arrest. They simply continued verifying one document after another, each confirming the impossible rather than disproving it. Before anyone could reach a conclusion, another vehicle entered the driveway. Evelyn had returned home earlier than expected from a meeting in Cincinnati. The moment she stepped out of her SUV, she saw the patrol cars, then looked toward the porch where Richard stood waiting. Everything happened in silence. The grocery bag slipped from her hands, scattering fruit across the driveway. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stood there staring at him as tears immediately filled her eyes. Richard took one cautious step forward before stopping himself. "Hello, Evelyn," he said softly. She covered her mouth with both hands as though trying to steady her breathing. For nearly a full minute, nobody spoke another word. Even the deputies remained silent, sensing they were witnessing something beyond ordinary police work. Finally, Evelyn whispered the words I will never forget. "I knew this day would come." Hearing those 6 words hurt more than I can adequately describe. They weren't the words of someone seeing a stranger. They weren't the words of someone confronting an impostor. They were the words of a woman facing a truth she had been carrying alone for years. In that single moment, I realized my marriage had been built upon secrets I had never even imagined. That evening, after the deputies quietly departed with promises that federal authorities would soon become involved, Evelyn finally told me everything. Years earlier, Richard had uncovered evidence that one of his closest business partners had been laundering millions of dollars through legitimate transportation contracts tied to organized financial crime. When Richard agreed to cooperate with federal investigators, authorities warned that his life and Evelyn's could be in immediate danger. Rather than risk retaliation before enough evidence had been gathered, an extraordinary decision was made. Richard would disappear under federal protection while a staged death concealed his whereabouts. Only a handful of people knew the truth. One federal prosecutor, 2 agents assigned to the investigation, Richard's attorney, and Evelyn herself. The closed casket, the funeral, the death certificate, and every public record had been part of a carefully orchestrated operation designed to convince dangerous individuals that Richard Harper no longer existed. The investigation, expected to last only several months, became increasingly complicated as new criminal networks were uncovered across multiple states. 1 year became 2. 2 became 3. Communication between Richard and Evelyn was almost non-existent, controlled entirely by federal authorities. Eventually, even those supervising the operation began believing Richard might never safely return to his previous life. They gave Evelyn permission to move forward if she chose. She had resisted for a long time before finally allowing herself to believe that her future no longer belonged to a man she might never see again. I wanted to be angry. Part of me was. Another part understood the impossible position she had faced. She hadn't married me for money. She hadn't manipulated me into becoming part of some elaborate deception. She had genuinely fallen in love again after believing the love of her life had been taken from her forever. Richard looked at me across the living room and quietly said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Daniel, if I could have spared you this pain, I would have. You gave Evelyn something I couldn't during those years. You gave her hope." There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment, only gratitude mixed with sadness. That somehow made everything even harder. The following morning, I packed a single suitcase. Evelyn stood beside the front door with tears streaming down her face, trying to find words that simply didn't exist. She reached for my hand, but neither of us knew what to say. Finally, I broke the silence. You never stopped loving him, did you? She closed her eyes for several seconds before answering honestly. No, she whispered, but I truly loved you too. Some people will hear those words and insist they cannot both be true. I used to think the same way. Now I know the human heart doesn't always follow simple rules. Love isn't erased simply because time passes, nor does new love automatically replace old love. Sometimes two truths can exist together, no matter how painful that may be. As I drove away from the Harper estate for the last time, I looked once in the rearview mirror. Richard and Evelyn were standing together on the front porch, not celebrating, not embracing, simply looking at one another after years of separation. There were no winners in that moment. Only three people whose lives had been permanently shaped by circumstances none of us had chosen. Months later, I learned that the federal investigation had resulted in multiple convictions involving financial fraud, money laundering, and organized criminal activity stretching across several states. Richard eventually resumed leadership of the company he had built, while Evelyn slowly rebuilt the life that had been interrupted twice, once by loss and once by an unexpected return. People still ask me whether I regret marrying a millionaire widow. My answer always surprises them. I don't regret loving Evelyn. I don't regret the years we shared. Those memories were real, even if the circumstances surrounding them were extraordinary. Life doesn't always offer clean endings or perfect justice. Sometimes it simply asks us to accept that the truth can be far more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. And every now and then, a man you watched being buried knocks on the front door, reminding you that the impossible isn't always impossible after all. If this story kept you guessing until the very end, let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you were Daniel, would you have stayed after learning the truth, or would you have made the same decision to walk away? We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy powerful stories of mystery, love, and unbelievable twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story.